The word lying hung in the congressional hearing room like a thunderclap. Senator Tim Scott's finger pointed accusingly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, his voice trembling with righteous indignation as he dismissed her voter suppression data as fabricated propaganda. Across the witness table, Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression calm as she reached for a manila folder that would destroy Scott's credibility within minutes. What happened next would shatter the carefully constructed narrative of a man who had spent years denying the very discrimination that his own financial records would prove he had helped perpetuate. Senator Tim Scott had built his political career on a seductive but dangerous narrative that America's racial problems were largely solved and that anyone claiming otherwise was trafficking in victimhood rather than truth. The 59-year-old South Carolina Republican, the only black member of the GOP Senate caucus, had spent over a decade positioning himself as living proof that systemic racism was a Democratic myth designed to maintain political control over minority communities. His polished speaking style and personal story of rising from poverty to the Senate floor made him a powerful weapon for conservatives seeking to dismiss ongoing civil rights concerns. Scott's brand depended entirely on convincing America that individual success stories like his own proved that structural barriers no longer existed. Sitting across from him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 44-year-old Texas Democrat whose legal expertise in civil rights law had given her intimate knowledge of how discrimination actually functioned in modern America. Unlike Scott's inspirational anecdotes, Crockett dealt in documented evidence, court cases, and statistical analysis that revealed the persistent reality of voter suppression, employment discrimination, and educational inequality. Her background as a civil rights attorney had taught her to be skeptical of politicians who used their personal success to minimize others' struggles, particularly when those politicians benefited politically from denying problems they had the power to address. Today's hearing on federal voting rights legislation would prove to be the arena where Scott's feel-good narrative met the harsh reality of documented discrimination, and where political rhetoric would crumble under the weight of irrefutable evidence. The congressional hearing on voting rights and election security had drawn national attention as Democrats pushed for federal legislation to protect minority voting access. The packed gallery included civil rights leaders, voting rights activists, and political observers who recognized this as a pivotal moment in the ongoing battle over American democracy. Scott's testimony had been a masterclass in conservative messaging, weaving together personal anecdotes and patriotic rhetoric to argue that Democratic concerns about voter suppression were greatly exaggerated. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," Scott began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the face of black conservatism, "we must be careful not to manufacture crises where none exist." He gestured broadly, his demeanor confident and dismissive. The voting rights legislation before us today is based on a false premise that America in 2025 resembles America in 1965. This simply isn't true. As someone who has experienced both poverty and success, discrimination and opportunity, I can tell you that this great nation provides equal access to the ballot box for all qualified citizens. Scott's voice rose with conviction as he warmed to his central theme. What we're seeing from the other side of the aisle is not concern for voting rights, but a cynical attempt to federalize elections and maintain political control by convincing minority communities that they are perpetual victims who cannot succeed without government intervention. When Crockett's turn came to respond, she began methodically presenting data showing documented cases of voter suppression in minority communities across the South. Her voice was measured and professional as she outlined polling place closures, voter purges, and discriminatory ID requirements that disproportionately affected Black and Latino voters. Scott's interruption was explosive and personal. "Congresswoman Crockett, with all due respect, you are lying to this committee and to the American people. These cherry-picked statistics and manufactured outrage are exactly what I'm talking about. You're promoting a false narrative that keeps our communities trapped in victimhood instead of empowering them to succeed." The accusation of lying reverberated through the chamber like a physical blow. The gallery fell into stunned silence as Scott's attack crossed the line from policy disagreement into personal character assassination. Crockett remained perfectly calm, but something dangerous had flickered in her eyes, the look of someone who had been underestimated and was about to prove it was a fatal mistake. Scott pressed his attack, confident that his personal story gave him unassailable moral authority on issues of race and discrimination. "I grew up in poverty in South Carolina, Congresswoman. I know what real discrimination looks like, and I also know what opportunity looks like when people are willing to work for it. His voice took on a lecturing tone that had intimidated many Democratic colleagues over the years. What you're presenting to this committee isn't evidence. It's political propaganda designed to justify federal overreach into state election laws. You're manufacturing a crisis to advance a partisan agenda. Crockett's response was swift and precise. Senator Scott, I understand you have strong feelings about this issue. But feelings don't override facts. The data I've presented comes from federal court cases, Department of Justice investigations, and bipartisan academic research. Are you suggesting that federal judges and DOJ attorneys are all lying? The question caught Scott off guard, but he quickly recovered. I'm suggesting that isolated incidents don't prove systemic problems, and that Democrats have a political interest in exaggerating these issues. Isolated incidents. Crockett's eyebrows rose slightly. Senator, in your own state of South Carolina, over 180,000 voters were purged from registration rolls between 2016 and 2020. 73% of those purged were from predominantly minority counties. Would you call that isolated? The room's energy shifted as Crockett began dismantling Scott's arguments with specific, verifiable data. Scott's confident expression started to crack as he realized he was facing someone who had done her homework. Those purges were necessary to maintain accurate voter rolls, Scott protested, but his voice lacked conviction. States have a responsibility to ensure election integrity. Election integrity, Crockett repeated, her tone sharpening. Senator, let me ask you about something specific. In 2020, your state closed 126 polling locations, with 89% of those closures occurring in counties with majority-minority populations. How does that protect election integrity? Scott's face reddened as he struggled to respond. Polling place consolidation is a matter of efficiency and cost savings. Efficiency. Crockett interrupted. Senator, some voters in rural South Carolina counties had to travel over 40 miles to reach their assigned polling location. Elderly voters, voters without reliable transportation, voters who work multiple jobs and can't take time off. How is that efficient? The gallery stirred as civil rights leaders recognized the devastating precision of Crockett's questioning. Scott was being systematically cornered by someone who understood the real-world impact of policies he had supported while claiming to champion black voters. You're taking these issues out of context, Scott said desperately. The overall picture in South Carolina shows expanding access to voting, not restriction. Crockett smiled, not with warmth, but with the quiet confidence of someone holding trump cards. Senator, since you mentioned the overall picture, let's examine your role in creating that picture. The moment that began Scott's destruction came when Crockett reached for a thick folder bearing the seal of the Federal Election Commission. Scott's eyes locked onto it with visible anxiety, sensing that his carefully maintained narrative was about to be shattered by documentation he couldn't dismiss or explain away. Senator Scott, you've spent considerable time today arguing that voter suppression is a manufactured crisis. You've suggested that people like me are lying about the experiences of minority voters, Crockett said, her tone shifting to something more prosecutorial. She opened a folder with deliberate precision. I'd like to discuss your campaign's financial relationship with the Heritage Foundation, specifically their public interest legal foundation, which has led voter purge efforts across the South. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Scott's confident demeanor evaporated as he realized where this was heading. My campaign accepts donations from many conservative organizations. This isn't about donations, Senator, Crockett interrupted smoothly. This is about coordination. According to these FEC filings, your campaign paid the Public Interest Legal Foundation $375,000 between 2018 and 2022 for what's described as voter outreach services. She held up a document for the cameras to see. But according to their own reports, the Public Interest Legal Foundation doesn't do voter outreach. They specialize in challenging voter registrations and advocating for voter roll purges. The same purges that removed 180,000 South Carolinians from rolls. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Scott's supporters looked stunned as the implications became clear. He had been paying organizations to suppress the very voters he claimed to represent. That's a complete mischaracterization, Scott protested weakly. Those payments were for legitimate legal services. Legal services aimed at removing minority voters from registration rolls, Crockett clarified, her voice cutting through his objections like a blade. Senator, you've been paying people to disenfranchise your own constituents while publicly claiming that voter suppression doesn't exist. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Scott sat frozen, unable to explain how someone who denied voter suppression could simultaneously be funding organizations dedicated to suppressing votes. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most devastating political exposures in congressional history. Scott, cornered and desperate, made the fatal mistake of attacking Crockett's credibility one final time, providing her with the opening to deliver a knockout blow that would end his moral authority forever. This is exactly the kind of gotcha politics that divides our country. Scott exploded, his voice rising to a near shout. You're taking routine campaign expenditures and spinning them into some conspiracy theory because you can't defend your own failed policies. This is why Black Americans are leaving the Democratic Party, because of this kind of dishonest, divisive rhetoric. The outburst was shocking in its desperation and deflection. Scott had abandoned all pretense of policy debate in favor of personal attacks and partisan talking points. But Crockett remained perfectly calm, letting his fury fill the room before responding with devastating precision. Senator Scott, thank you for that response. It perfectly illustrates why this conversation is necessary, she began, her voice growing stronger and more authoritative with each word. She stood up, holding a second folder that silenced the room completely. You want to talk about why Black Americans are leaving the Democratic Party? Let's talk about the Black Americans in your own state who can't vote because of policies you've supported and organizations you've funded. Her voice rose with moral authority as she opened the folder. This is a letter from Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an 83-year-old resident of Charleston County. She's been voting in the same precinct for 47 years. In 2020, her polling place was closed as part of those efficiency measures you mentioned. The new location was 12 miles away, and Mrs. Washington doesn't drive anymore. Crockett's voice cracked slightly with emotion as she continued. Mrs. Washington tried to vote anyway. Her grandson drove her to the new location, but they were told she had been purged from the rolls due to inactivity. She had voted in every election since 1976, senator. Every single one. The room was dead silent except for the sound of her voice. Mrs. Washington died last year without casting another vote. She spent her final years believing that her country no longer wanted her voice heard. And according to these documents, your campaign helped pay for the very systems that silenced her. Scott tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up her hand and continued, her voice rising to fill every corner of the chamber. You want to know what divides our country, Senator? It's politicians who use their personal success stories to deny the struggles of others. It's Black leaders who get elected and then pull up the ladder behind them. It's representatives who take money from voter suppression organizations while claiming that voter suppression doesn't exist. She looked directly at Scott, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. You have betrayed every principle you claim to represent. You have taken the trust of Black voters and used it to fund their own disenfranchisement. You have turned your personal story of success into a weapon against your own community. The silence that followed was deafening. Scott sat completely motionless, his earlier fury replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose hypocrisy had been exposed in the most public way possible. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation as Crockett delivered her final blow. The truth doesn't need to shout, Senator Scott. It just needs to be documented. Within minutes, social media exploded with unprecedented intensity. #ScottExposed and #CrockettDestroysScott began trending worldwide as video clips of the confrontation were shared millions of times across every platform. The moment when Scott's campaign funding for voter suppression was revealed became an instant symbol of political hypocrisy meeting its match in documented evidence. News networks across the political spectrum scrambled to cover the story. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Scott's position, with several noting that the financial connections to voter suppression organizations were impossible to explain away and deeply damaging to his credibility. Civil rights leaders hailed Crockett's performance as a masterful demonstration of how to counter false narratives with irrefutable facts. The impact extended far beyond politics into American civil rights discourse. The story of Mrs. Dorothy Washington became a rallying cry for voting rights advocates, humanizing the abstract concept of voter suppression in a way that made its cruelty undeniable. Civil rights organizations began using clips of Crockett's testimony in their own advocacy campaigns. Scott's office was flooded with calls demanding explanations for his campaign's payments to voter suppression organizations. Several prominent Black conservatives distanced themselves from Scott, recognizing that his conduct had become indefensible. His carefully constructed image as a champion of black success was shattered, replaced by documented evidence of his role in black disenfranchisement. Democratic leaders praised Crockett's performance as a watershed moment for political accountability, proving that personal narratives could not override documented evidence of harmful actions. The confrontation accelerated national conversations about voting rights that had been stalled for years. In the days that followed, political analysts would debate what had made Crockett's takedown so devastating. Some pointed to her superior preparation and legal expertise. Others emphasized how she had connected abstract policy debates to human stories that revealed their real-world consequences. But the real power of the moment lay in its moral clarity. It had exposed the difference between authentic representation and political performance. For too long, American politics had been dominated by politicians who used their personal success stories to deny systemic problems while secretly perpetuating those very problems for political gain. Scott had embodied this contradiction, claiming to represent black voters while funding their disenfranchisement. Crockett had shattered that entire framework by demonstrating what authentic accountability looked like when backed by irrefutable evidence.